The spear point kissed the hollow of Amos Fletcher's throat before he even saw the woman holding it. He had been kneeling in the mud at the foot of the toll bridge, lantern in one hand and a cut length of rope in the other, trying to work out who had sawed through the guide rope that kept wagons from sliding off the planks in the dark. One moment he was alone with the black rush of the Ashwater River below him and the creak of old timber above. The next, cold iron rested against his skin, and a voice like gravel dragged over stone spoke out of the dark. "Drop the rope, little man, and tell me why you crawl beneath my crossing at night with a blade in your hand." Amos went very still. He was not a fool, whatever else people said of him, and he knew better than to make a sudden move with a spearhead an inch from his windpipe. He let his eyes travel up the haft of the weapon, past a forearm corded with muscle and banded in dark leather, to a face that stole the breath clean out of his lungs before the fear even had the chance to. She was orc, unmistakably the green-gray cast of her skin, the strong jut of her jaw, the twin tusks that curved up from her lower lip, pale as bone in the lantern light. But there was nothing crude or brutish in her, nothing like the woodcut illustrations in the broadsheets that came through with the caravans, all snarl and slaver. Her black hair was pulled back in a tight braid that fell past one shoulder, and her eyes, when they caught the light, were a deep amber gold, sharp with intelligence and something that might have been amusement. She wore fitted travel leathers, dark and supple, laced snug from throat to waist, and cinched with a wide belt that showed the strong, curving line of her body, with a fur mantle thrown back off one shoulder to leave her spear arm free. She was taller than him by half a head, and she held the spear like it was an extension of her own arm, without strain, without doubt. "That's not a blade," Amos said, and his voice only shook a little. "It's a knife for cutting rope." I was fixing what somebody else cut. Her eyes narrowed, flicking to the frayed guide rope still clutched in his other fist, then back to his face. "A man out alone on a war bridge at night, cutting rope in the dark, claims he is only mending it," she said. "That is a very convenient story." "It's the true one," he said. "I'm the bridge-warden here. Been the bridge-warden here 6 years. Names, I did not ask your title," she said, cutting him off, though the spear did not move. "I asked nothing yet at all." He swallowed carefully around the point still resting against his throat. "You want to ask something, you're welcome to. I'm not going anywhere." For a moment she only studied him, head tilted slightly, the way a hunting hawk considers a rabbit that has not yet decided to run. Behind her, in the tree shadow at the northern end of the bridge, Amos could make out 3 more shapes, orc warriors, still and watchful, spears grounded but ready. This was no lone raider. This was a war band, and he was one unarmed tollkeeper standing between them and the only crossing over the Ashwater for 20 miles in either direction. "What is your name?" she said at last, and it was not really a question, not in the way she said it. It came out low and deliberate, like she meant to have it whether he gave it freely or not. "Amos," he said. "Amos Fletcher." Something shifted behind her eyes when he said it, not softening, not yet, but a kind of recalibration, as if the name had weight she had not expected a mud-kneed tollkeeper to carry. She held the spear a moment longer, then, slow and deliberate, drew it back and set the butt of it against the planks with a hollow thock that echoed off the water below. "Dura Doomhammer," she said. "You will remember it." "Believe me," Amos said, letting out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, "I already will." That was how it began, not with courtship or careful words exchanged over a fence rail, but with a spear at his throat and a name given like a blade laid down between them, an offering that could just as easily have been a threat. Amos Fletcher had held the toll post at Stonewade Crossing for 6 years, ever since the old warden, a stooped man named Herrick, had died of a winter fever and left the charter and the little stone toll house to whoever the Crown's Reeve saw fit to appoint. Amos had been a soldier once, briefly, in the border levies during the last flare of the Ashwater War, and he had come home from it with a slight limp in his left leg and no taste at all for further fighting. The Reeve had needed someone steady, someone who would not start trouble with the caravans that came through from both the human kingdom of Veldrick and the orc clans of the Ironback Mountains. And Amos, quiet and careful and good with his hands, had fit the post like it was cut for him. Stonewade was not a town so much as a crossroads that had grown stubborn roots. It sat where the old trade road met the Ashwater River, the only crossing for many miles where the banks were gentle enough for wagons, and so it had become, over the decades, the one place where humans and orcs did business face to face instead of at the point of a sword. There was a saloon with a plank floor scarred by 100 different kinds of boots and claws, a trading post that stocked both iron nails and orc bone charms, a smithy, a chapel that saw more arguments than prayers, and above it all, at the foot of the bridge itself, Amos's toll house, a squat building of gray stone with a shingled roof and a lantern that burned every night so no one crossing in the dark would miss the crossing entirely and end up in the river. For 6 years he had collected tolls, mended the bridge, kept the peace between drunk teamsters and prouder still orc traders, and gone home every night to the small room above the toll house where he ate his supper alone, and read the same 3 books over and over because caravans rarely brought new ones through. He was not an unhappy man, exactly. But he had noticed, in recent years, a certain hollowness that crept in around the edges of the evenings, a sense that he was a fixture of the crossing the way the bridge itself was, solid and useful and utterly unremarked. That had been true right up until the night a spear found his throat in the dark. The morning after, word had already run through Stonewade like fire through dry grass. An orc warband had come down out of the Ironbacks and was camped a half-mile from the bridge, and their leader was a woman. Amos heard it first from Cobb, who ran the trading post and liked to talk more than he liked to sell goods. A woman leading a war band, Cobb said, shaking his head as he weighed out nails. Never heard the like. Orc women fight, sure, everyone knows that, but leading a whole band this far into human land, that's something else. She's not raiding, Amos said. She told me herself. They're the vanguard for the treaty talks. Advance scouts, making sure the crossing's secure before the envoys come through. Cobb's eyebrows went up. You talked with her. She had a spear at my throat at the time, but yes. Cobb laughed, delighted and a little appalled, and by noon that story too had run the length of Stonewade, embellished each time it changed hands, until by evening half the town believed Amos Fletcher had wrestled an orc chieftain bare-handed on the bridge at midnight. He did not bother correcting it. He had more pressing things to think about, namely, the fact that in 3 days' time, the first formal envoys from both the Crown of Veldrick and the Ironback clans were due to meet at Stonewade to hammer out the terms of a peace that half the border wanted and the other half dreaded. And someone had already tried to sabotage the bridge before a single envoy had arrived. He found Dura Doomhammer again that same afternoon, this time in daylight, at the edge of the trampled meadow where her band had made camp. She was crouched over a length of harness leather, mending a strap with quick, sure fingers, and in the sunlight he could see her clearly for the first time, the strong planes of her face, a thin white scar along one cheekbone, the way the leather of her travel gear hugged the curve of her waist and hip as she worked. She looked up before he had gotten within 20 paces, as if she had known he was coming the moment he left the toll house. "Bridge-warden," she said, and there was the faintest note of amusement in how she said it, as though the title itself were a small joke between them now. "Come to arrest me for last night's fright. Come to ask what you found," Amos said. "You were looking for something under my bridge, same as me. I want to know what." She set the strap down and rose, and even sitting she had seemed formidable, but standing she seemed to fill the whole clearing. "Someone has been testing the bridge," she said, "weakening the pilings, cutting ropes in places a careless drover would blame on rot, not sabotage. I have seen war prepared for in quieter ways than this." "You think it's my people," Amos said. "I think," Dura said, "that someone on both sides of this river does not want the treaty to hold. And I think, Bridge-warden, that you and I are going to have to decide whether we trust each other, because if this crossing fails before the envoys even arrive, there will be no talks. There will only be war, and this time it will not stop at a river. Amos looked at her for a long moment, this warrior who could have killed him without breaking a sweat the night before, who instead stood in a sunlit meadow speaking of trust as though it were a tool she intended to use carefully and not waste. "All right," he said. "Let's find out who's cutting my ropes then." Something in her expression eased just slightly, like a held breath let go. "All right," she agreed. They spent the better part of that week working the bridge together, and Amos found himself, against every instinct honed by years of caution, looking forward to the mornings. Dura moved through the world with a directness that startled him at first, and then, slowly, began to feel like a kind of relief. She said what she meant, asked what she wanted to know, and did not waste breath on the careful evasions that passed for conversation among the caravan folk. When he showed her how the pilings were driven and how a saboteur might weaken one without it showing above the waterline, she listened with total attention, then waded into the cold river herself, without hesitation, to check the timbers below the surface with her own hands. "You didn't have to do that," he said when she came up dripping, her braids slicked dark against her shoulder, her leathers clinging to her. "No," she agreed, wringing water from the end of her braid. "I wanted to see for myself. I do not trust another's eyes for a thing I can check myself. That going to be a problem, trusting people, I mean, given why you're here." She fixed him with a look, amber eyes bright with river water, and something more complicated. "I trust people who earn it, Fletcher. So far you have not given me a reason not to." It was the first time she had used his surname without the title in front of it, and it landed somewhere in his chest with more weight than it had any right to. He found himself grinning like a fool and did not much care. They found the culprit on the fourth day, not a spy from either side of the treaty, as Dura had feared, but a hired man working for a Veldrick border lord named Corvin Ashgrave, whose family fortune ran on iron and steel sold to the crown's border garrisons. A lasting peace meant a shrinking market for swords and spearheads, and Ashgrave, it seemed, had decided that a war interrupted by an ill-timed bridge collapse, one that could be blamed on orc treachery, was worth more to him than a peace that would beggar his forges. They caught the saboteur, a wiry man named Tull, trying to work a fresh cut into a piling at dusk, and it was Dura who caught him by the collar and hauled him bodily out of the water while Amos held a lantern and a length of rope to bind his wrists. Tull talked fast once he understood exactly how close Dura's tusks were to his throat, and by the time the moon was up, Amos had a full confession and the name of the Lord behind it, and Dura had a fury banked low and dangerous behind her eyes. "Ashgrave," she said, turning the word over like a stone she meant to throw. "This is the man who would burn the treaty to keep his forges hot." "Looks that way," Amos said. "I'll send word to the Reeve tonight. This needs to go up the chain fast before the envoys arrive. And if the Reeve is slow, or bought, the same as this fool's master." Amos looked at her, at the barely restrained violence coiled in her shoulders, and understood with a lurch that if he did not manage this carefully, Dura Doomhammer was entirely capable of riding straight to Ashgrave's keep and settling the matter with her spear, an act that would hand the warmongers exactly the incident they wanted. "Then we make sure he isn't slow," Amos said. "I'll ride with the message myself if I have to." "But Dura, if you go after Ashgrave now, tonight, with a warband at your back, you know what that looks like to every frightened farmer between here and the capital. It looks like exactly the raid they've been told to fear their whole lives. It hands him the war he wants." She was silent a long moment, jaw tight, and he watched her master something inside herself, the same way he had seen soldiers master fear before a charge. "You are right," she said finally, the words costing her something. "I do not like it, but you are right." "I know it's not easy," he said, quieter, trusting the slow way instead of the sword, "but I'll ride with you every step of it if it comes to that. You're not carrying this alone." She looked at him then in a way that made the lantern light seem suddenly very warm, very close. "You are a strange little man, Fletcher," she said. "Most of your kind flinch from me." You offer to ride into a border lord's keep at my side. Most of your kind would have killed me on the bridge and not thought twice, he said. You asked my name first. I wanted to know whose life I was deciding, she said simply. It seemed the least I owed a man before I judged whether he should die. Well, Amos said, I'm glad you asked. So am I, she said, and for a moment neither of them moved, the confession hanging there between them, plainer than either of them had meant it to be. The reeve, to Amos's relief, was neither slow nor bought. He was, in fact, terrified of exactly the sort of scandal a saboteur working for a border lord would cause, and he moved fast, dispatching riders to the capital with Tull's confession and a formal complaint against Ashgrave before 2 more days had passed. It would take weeks for any real judgment to come down from the crown, but for now, Ashgrave's plot had been named and blunted, and the bridge stood ready to receive the envoys. That did not mean the danger was past. Dura made that clear to Amos on the evening before the envoys were due, as they stood together on the bridge in the long gold light of sunset, the ashwater running dark and swift beneath them. A man like Ashgrave does not give up his war so easily, she said. He has lost one plot. He will try another. And now he knows you and I are watching for it together, which makes us both targets. You think he'd come after us directly? I think, Dura said, that a warband cannot be everywhere, and a lone bridge-warden is easy prey for men with coin enough to hire more than one Tull. She turned to face him fully, and there was something fierce and unguarded in her expression that he had not seen before. I do not intend to let that happen. I can look after myself, Amos said, though it came out gentler than he meant, because the truth was no one had spoken about looking after him in a very long time, and something in him ached at the sound of it. I did not say you could not, Dura said. I said I do not intend to let it happen. There is a difference. She reached out then, and touched 2 fingers briefly to the side of his jaw. A touch so light he might have imagined it if the heat of it hadn't lingered on his skin long after her hand fell away. You matter to this treaty, Fletcher, more than you know. Do not make me regret trusting that to your care alone. He did not have words for what that touch did to him, so he said the only true thing he had. You won't regret it, I promise you that. She held his gaze a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, before she turned and walked back toward her camp, and Amos stood alone on the bridge for a long while after, watching the river run black beneath the stars, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely and thoroughly seen. The envoys arrived 3 days later in a procession that brought half the county out to watch. A column of Veldrick knights in polished mail flanking a black lacquered carriage bearing the crown's own emissary, Lady Usselt Marrow, a sharp-eyed woman known for her cold diplomacy. And from the north, descending the mountain road in a slow, deliberate line, the Ironback delegation, led by an old orc chieftain named Cregor Ashfang, gray-bearded and heavy with battle scars, flanked by Dura and a dozen of her warriors. Stonewade had never seen anything like it. The crossroads swelled with tents and wagons and curious onlookers from every farmstead within a day's ride. All of them come to gawk at the sight of orcs and humans camped within shouting distance of one another, without swords drawn. Amos found himself busier than he had ever been in 6 years at the toll house, managing traffic across the bridge, settling disputes over camp space, and serving, whether he had asked for the role or not, as the one man both delegations seemed willing to speak to without suspicion. It was Lady Marrow herself who noticed it first. "You're the bridge-warden who uncovered Ashgrave's plot," she said to him on the second evening, over the noise of the crossroads settling into an uneasy dusk. "And I am told the Ironback war leader trusts your word above most others on this side of the river. That is a rare thing, Master Fletcher, rarer than you perhaps realize. I just kept the bridge standing, my lady. Seemed like the job. Modesty is a fine quality," she said, "but do not mistake your worth here. A treaty is only as strong as the trust between the people who must live beside it after the ink dries. You are already doing the work that treaties are meant to accomplish. I would remember that if I were you." He did not know what to make of that at the time, but he turned it over in his mind that night, lying awake in the little room above the toll house, listening to the distant murmur of two camps that had spent generations trying to kill each other now settling in for an uneasy, hopeful sleep on opposite banks of the same river. The treaty talks themselves stretched over the following 2 weeks, conducted in the long common hall that Stonewade's townsfolk hastily built from green timber and canvas at the edge of the crossroads, and Amos found himself drawn into them more and more, not as a diplomat, but as the steady, practical hand who knew the crossing, knew the people, and increasingly knew Dura well enough that Creagor Ashfang himself began addressing questions to the bridge-warden when tempers ran high on both sides of the table. It was during those weeks that the current between Amos and Dura, which had run swift and quiet since the night of the spear, began to surface in smaller, unguarded moments. She took to walking the bridge with him each evening after the day's talks ended, ostensibly to check for further sabotage, though they both understood by the second week that the checking was mostly an excuse. She asked him questions about his life before the toll house, his soldiering years, the leg he favored, the family he had lost to a fever the same winter old Herrick died, and he found himself telling her things he had never told anyone in Stonewade, not because she demanded them, but because she listened the way she did everything else completely, without distraction. In turn, she told him of her own life, of growing up in the shadow of the Ironback Peaks, the daughter of a war leader who had died defending a mountain pass that no longer mattered to anyone, of earning her place at the head of a war band not through birthright but through a duel fought and won against 3 rivals in a single brutal season, of the loneliness that came with command, the way her own warriors respected her too much to ever speak to her as an equal, let alone as a woman who might want, sometimes, simply to be spoken to without the weight of rank between them. "You don't have that weight with me," Amos said one evening as they stood at the bridge's midpoint, the water black and endless beneath them, the lanterns of both camps glowing warm on either bank. "Never have. I don't know how to talk to a war leader. I only know how to talk to you." "Good," she said, low. "I am tired of being talked to as a war leader. I would rather be talked to as myself." She turned to face him fully, closer than she had ever stood before, close enough that he had to tip his head back slightly to meet her eyes. "You do that without trying, Fletcher. Do you know how rare that is for someone like me?" "I don't know what someone like you finds rare," he said, "but I know what I find rare. A woman who could put a spear through me before I blinked, choosing instead to stand here and talk to me about home." "Perhaps," Dura said, "I like talking to you more than I like the idea of putting a spear through you." A ghost of a smile curved her mouth, tusks catching the lantern light. "Though the night is young." He laughed, surprised into it, and she laughed too, a rare, rich sound he had not heard from her before. And in that moment, standing on the bridge between 2 camps and 2 peoples who had spent 100 years trying to destroy each other, Amos Fletcher understood that he had fallen entirely and helplessly in love with Dura Doomhammer, and that he had no idea, not the faintest idea, what to do about it. He did not have to wonder long. It was 2 nights later, after a bruising day of negotiations that had nearly collapsed over grazing rights along the river's northern bank, that Dura found him alone at the toll house, sitting on the stone step with a cup of cooling tea he hadn't touched, staring out at the dark water and turning over the day's frustrations in his mind. She sat beside him without asking, close enough that her shoulder brushed his, and for a while neither of them spoke. "You looked like you wanted to put your fist through Ashfang's table today," Amos said finally. "I wanted several things today," Dura said. "Ashfang's stubbornness was only one of them." She turned her head, and in the lantern light her eyes were very dark, very close. "Do you know what else I wanted, Fletcher?" His heart was suddenly loud in his own ears. "Tell me." "I wanted to know," she said slowly, "whether a man who is not afraid of me, who speaks to me as an equal, who rode toward danger for a treaty that was never his fight to begin with, whether such a man would flinch if I did this." She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a soft or hesitant thing. There was nothing hesitant in Dura Doomhammer, and her mouth against his was hungry and certain, one strong hand coming up to cup the back of his neck, as though she meant to make absolutely sure he understood this was not an accident, not a mistake to be laughed off in the morning. Amos made a small sound against her lips and kissed her back with everything 6 years of quiet loneliness had built up in him, his hand finding her waist, the leather warm beneath his palm. And for a long, dizzy moment the treaty and the war and all of Stonewade fell away, and there was only this, her mouth, her breath, the fierce and startling tenderness of a woman who could have killed him 100 times over, choosing instead to hold him like something precious. When she finally drew back just far enough to look at him, her breath was unsteady and her eyes were bright with something fierce and unguarded. "You did not flinch," she said. "Wasn't planning to," Amos said, a little breathless himself. "Was hoping you'd do that again, actually." Her laugh this time was low and warm and entirely for him. "I intend to," she said, "many times, but I wished you to know first that I do not do this lightly. My people do not give their hearts as easily as yours are said to. When I choose, Fletcher, I choose completely." "Good," Amos said, cupping her jaw in his hand, marveling at the fact that she let him, that she leaned into the touch instead of pulling away. "Because I already chose. Somewhere around the second time you dragged me out of that river, I think." "Third time," she corrected, smiling against his palm. "You are forgetting the incident with the collapsing bank." "I'm choosing to forget the collapsing bank," he said, and kissed her again, and this time neither of them was in any hurry to stop. They did not tell anyone, not at first, not because either of them was ashamed, but because the treaty balanced on a blade's edge already, and neither of them wished to hand Ashgrave or any other warmonger a fresh scandal to twist into fear. But secrets are hard to keep at a crossroads where everyone watches everyone else, and it was not long before knowing looks passed between Dura's warriors, and Cobb at the trading post began charging Amos double for the wildflowers he took to buying on his walks past the meadow, on the theory, loudly stated, that a man did not need that many flowers for his own windowsill. The treaty talks, meanwhile, ground on through argument after argument, grazing rights, tribute, the fate of border garrisons, the thorny question of which laws would govern a crossing point belonging fully to neither side. Lady Marrow proved a formidable negotiator, cold and precise, but fair. Cregar Ashfang matched her stubbornness with his own, unwilling to concede anything that might look, to his own clans back in the mountains, like weakness. More than once the talks nearly broke apart entirely, and more than once it was Amos, standing quietly at the edge of the hall, who found some small practical solution, a compromise on toll rates, a suggestion for shared patrol of the crossing, that let both sides step back from the brink without losing face. "You have a gift for this," Dura told him one night, as they lay together beneath the stars on a hillside above the meadow, her head resting against his chest, his fingers idly tracing the scar along her cheekbone. "Ashfang listens to you. Marrow listens to you. I do not think either of them realizes how much you are shaping this treaty." "I'm not shaping anything," Amos said. "I'm just the tollkeeper who doesn't want to see his bridge burned down." "You are the reason two peoples who hate each other might yet learn to share a river," Dura said. "Do not shrink from that, Fletcher. It does not suit you." He turned his head to look at her, at the strong line of her jaw silvered by moonlight, and felt something in his chest that he had no name for except that it felt at long last like being necessary, not merely tolerated, not merely useful, but wanted, needed, seen entirely for who he was. "I love you," he said before he had quite decided to say it, the words simply falling out of him into the quiet dark. Dura went very still against him. Then slowly, she pushed herself up on one elbow to look down at him, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. "You should not say such things lightly," she said, and there was an edge of warning in it, though her hand had found his and did not let go. "I'm not saying it lightly," Amos said. "I've never meant anything more in my life." For a long moment she only looked at him, searching his face for whatever truth she needed to find there. Then softly she said, "Among my people love is not spoken, it is marked." "Marked how?" "A claiming bite," she said. "Given only once, only to the one a warrior chooses above all others, in a moment that matters, a moment of victory, of truth, of survival earned together. It is not a thing given for words alone. It must be earned in blood and fire, the way all things worth keeping are earned." She traced her thumb slowly across his knuckles. "I do not know yet if such a moment will come for us, Fletcher, but when it does, if it does, you will know it. And I think by then I will not need to hear you say the words at all. I will already know them." He did not fully understand what she meant, not then, but he heard the promise beneath it, and it was enough. "Then I'll wait," he said, "however long it takes." "I do not think," Dura said, settling back against him, "that it will take so very long, not with Ashgrave still out there, hungry for his war." She was right, though neither of them yet knew how soon, or how terribly, that moment would come. It came 11 days later, on the night the treaty was to be signed. The final terms had been hammered out at last: shared toll rights along the crossing, a joint patrol of orcs and humans to keep the peace, grazing lands divided fair enough that neither side felt robbed, and a formal end to the raids and reprisals that had bled the border for 2 generations. Lady Marrow and Cregar Ashfang were to sign the treaty at dawn, in full view of both camps and the gathered folk of Stonewood, a public act meant to make the peace real in a way no sealed document alone ever could. Amos should have known Ashgrave would not let it happen quietly. He was making his last round of the bridge near midnight, lantern in hand, checking the pilings out of old habit more than real suspicion, when he heard it, the soft creak of oars in the water downstream, more than there should have been for any honest fisherman at that hour. He crept to the bank and saw them by starlight. Boats, a dozen of them at least, crammed with armed men in dark cloaks, sliding silently along the far side of the river toward the sleeping camps. He did not think. He ran. The alarm bell at the toll house had not rung in 6 years, not once, and it took Amos 3 frantic pulls on the rope before the great iron clapper found its voice and sent a deep, tolling clang rolling out over the water and the sleeping crossroads. Lanterns began flaring to life in both camps almost at once, shouts rising, and Amos was already sprinting for Dura's tent, his bad leg screaming in protest, when the first arrows began to fall. Ashgrave had not sent a handful of saboteurs this time. He had sent an army mercenaries dressed to look like a rogue orc raiding party, meant to slaughter both delegations in the dark and let the corpses tell whatever lie best served his war. Amos understood that in the same instant Dura burst from her tent already armored, spear in hand, her eyes blazing with a fury he had never seen in her before. "Ambush," he gasped. "Boats on the river, dozens of men, they're dressed to look like—" "I see them," Dura snarled, already moving, bellowing orders in the guttural tongue of the ironbacks that sent her warriors scrambling into formation, even half-dressed and half asleep. "Fletcher, get to the human camp," warned Marrow. "Tell her the truth of it before her own soldiers see orc shapes in the dark and start killing the wrong enemy." Amos ran. It was the hardest run of his life, his leg burning, arrows hissing past him close enough to feel the wind of their passing. But he made it to the edge of the human camp just as Lady Marrow's guard captain was rallying men with swords drawn and murder in their eyes, ready to charge the ironback camp on the mistaken belief that the orcs had broken the peace first. "No!" Amos screamed, throwing himself bodily into the captain's path. "It's not them. It's mercenaries dressed as raiders. Ashgrave's men. Look at the boats. Look at the river. They came from downstream where no honest orc scout would cross." For one agonizing heartbeat he thought the captain would cut him down where he stood for the delay. Then Lady Marrow herself appeared, night-robed but sharp-eyed as ever, and one look at the boats still visible against the starlit water was enough to confirm Amos's words. "Hold," she bellowed, a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. "Turn your swords to the river, not the mountain camp. We have a common enemy tonight." It should not have been possible to survive what came next. The mercenaries, seeing their ambush unraveling, threw off all pretense and came on in full force, dozens of armed men pouring from the boats to storm both camps at once, clearly hoping to overwhelm the smaller, unprepared forces before dawn broke and reinforcements could arrive. Amos found himself in the thick of it before he had time to be afraid, fighting alongside human soldiers he barely knew, and further along the chaotic line, catching glimpses of Dura's warriors cutting through the attackers with brutal, disciplined efficiency. But the mercenaries had numbers, and they had chosen their moment well. Most of the treaty guards were half-armed, roused from sleep, fighting in the dark against an enemy that had planned for exactly this chaos. Amos took a glancing blow to the shoulder from a mercenary's sword that sent him sprawling into the mud, his borrowed blade knocked from his hand, and for one terrible instant he was certain he was about to die on the very ground where he had spent 6 quiet years keeping toll. Then Dura was there. She came out of the dark like something out of the old war songs, spear singing in a wide arc that took the mercenary's legs from under him before his blade could fall, and in the same motion she hauled Amos up by his good arm and shoved him bodily behind her, putting her own body between him and the next wave of attackers without hesitation, without even seeming to think about it. "Stay behind me," she snarled, and there was no room for argument in it. "Dura, there's too many. Then we make there be fewer," she roared and threw herself back into the fight with a ferocity that made even the mercenaries falter. What followed was the kind of last stand that gets told and retold until no one is certain anymore how much of it is true. The toll bridge itself became the choke point, the one place where the fleeing remnants of both camps, human and orc together, rallied to make their final defense, because the mercenaries could only cross it a few at a time, and every soldier who had ever crossed that bridge in daylight knew exactly how narrow and treacherous its planks became in the dark. Amos, weaponless but not useless, remembered the very sabotage he and Dura had hunted weeks before and between clashes, worked frantically at the same weakened piling they had once repaired, this time deliberately, cutting the last of its supports so that, when a mass of mercenaries surged onto the bridge in a final desperate charge, the whole northern span gave way beneath them with a groan of tortured timber and pitched a dozen armed men screaming into the black river below. It broke the attacks back. What mercenaries remained, seeing their numbers gutted and their own commander among the men thrown into the Ashwater's current, broke and fled into the dark, pursued by the rallying soldiers of both camps until dawn finally broke gray and bloody over Stonewade, revealing a battlefield that both sides, against every terrible odd, had survived. Amos found Dura at the river's edge as the sun came up, breathing hard, her leathers torn and dark with blood that was not entirely her own, a shallow cut along her forearm that she seemed not to have noticed yet. He was bleeding too, his shoulder throbbing, his hands shaking now that the fighting had finally stopped, but he was alive, and so was she, and around them the wreckage of the northern bridge span smoked faintly where a dropped lantern had caught the broken timber alight. "You're hurt," he said, reaching for her arm. "So are you," she said, but she let him take her hand, let him press a strip of torn cloth against the cut, and for a long moment they simply stood there, breathing, alive, the weight of everything that had almost happened settling slowly over both of them. "We should not have survived that," Amos said quietly. "Any of it. That charge on the bridge." "We survived it because we fought it together," Dura said. "Human blade and orc spear, side by side, defending a crossing that belongs to both our peoples. Do you understand what that means, Fletcher? What it will mean when Ashfang and Marrow see what was done here tonight in their name to protect their peace?" "I understand it means Ashgrave's plot just handed them the strongest argument for this treaty they could ever have asked for," Amos said. "Nobody's going to forget this morning." "Not for a generation." "No," Dura agreed, "they will not." She turned to face him fully then, and something in her expression had changed since the night before, something settled and certain that had not been there even in their softest, most private moments. "Fletcher, Amos, It was the first time she had ever used only his given name, without title or surname, and it landed on him like a vow. "This is the moment," she said. "Blood and fire, victory earned together, truth spoken between us with nothing left hidden. You asked me once if I would ever mark you as my own. I am asking you now, in return, will you have it? Will you carry my claim, knowing what it means, knowing what it will cost you among your own people to be known as an orc woman's chosen mate?" Amos did not hesitate, not for one heartbeat. "I've been yours since the second time you dragged me out of that river," he said. "Third time, whatever you want to call it, mark me, Dura. I'm not afraid of what anyone thinks." Her eyes were bright, fierce, and for once entirely unguarded. "Then hold still," she said, "and know that I do not do this lightly." She drew him close, one hand cradling the side of his neck, and when she bit down, careful, deliberate, a sharp, bright sting just where his shoulder met his throat, deep enough to mark but gentle enough to be a gift and not a wound of war. Amos felt something settle into place in his chest that he did not have words for, some ancient certainty older than either of their people's long history of hatred. When she drew back, there was blood on her lips and something like wonder in her eyes, and she pressed her forehead to his, breathing hard, as though the act had cost her something and given her everything all at once. "There," she said, low and rough. "Now every orc from the Ironbacks to the Ashfang Peaks will know you are mine, Amos Fletcher, and any man of Veldrick with eyes to see will know it too, whether he understands the custom or not." "Good," Amos said, his voice unsteady, his hand coming up to cover the mark now throbbing warm at his throat. "Let them see. I've got nothing to hide, and neither do you." She kissed him then, softly this time, blood and salt and something achingly tender, and around them the wounded, exhausted survivors of the night's battle began to gather at the river's edge, and here and there Amos caught sight of a soldier or a warrior pausing, staring at the sight of the bridge-warden, and the war leader locked in an embrace neither of them seemed inclined to end. And for once, he found he did not care one bit what any of them thought. It was not, of course, so simple as that. No story of two peoples with 100 years of bad blood between them resolves entirely in a single dawn, however dramatic. In the days that followed, as the treaty was finally signed atop the ruins of the collapsed bridge span, with Lady Marrow and Cregar Ashfang clasping hands before both camps in a gesture meant to be remembered for generations, whispers still ran through Stonewade about the bridge-warden, and the orc chieftain's mark now plain on his throat for anyone to see. Not everyone in the Crossroads town was pleased. There was a particular ugliness in it that Amos had half expected, and still found harder to bear than he'd imagined. A group of teamsters who had lost kin in the old border raids refused outright to pay their toll at his hand, spitting at his feet instead, and calling him things that made his jaw clench, even as he made himself stand still and take it. Old Mother Pricewell, who ran the chapel, preached one Sunday about the dangers of consorting with beasts, though she was careful never to name Amos directly, and half the congregation walked out rather than sit through it, which gave him some hope even in the midst of the sting. Cobb, to his credit, never once wavered, clapping Amos on the good shoulder the very morning the mark first showed and saying only, "About time you found somebody who'd actually put up with you, Fletcher," which was as close to a blessing as the man's gruff nature ever offered. Dura bore the whispers with a warrior's discipline, but Amos saw what it cost her, saw the way her jaw tightened when a farmwife pulled her children back from the market stalls at her approach, the way her hand sometimes drifted, unconsciously, to the hilt of her belt knife, when a group of young men muttered too loudly as she passed. It was Dura, in fact, who first raised the possibility of leaving Stonewade altogether. "There are places in the Ironbacks," she said one evening, weeks after the treaty's signing, as they sat together on the toll-house step watching the last caravan of the day cross the Mendied Bridge, for the northern span had been rebuilt, stronger than before, timber and stone reinforced by workers from both camps working side by side. Villages where an orc and a human might live without every glance weighing on them like a stone. I do not ask it of you, Amos, but I would not blame you for wanting it. Amos considered this for a long moment, watching the wagon wheels rumble over planks he had laid with his own hands years before old Herrick died and left him this post. I've thought about it, he admitted. Would be easier, probably, somewhere nobody knew us. Nobody had opinions about what we are to each other. He turned to look at her. But I built this bridge back up with my own hands, Dura. I've kept this crossing for 6 years before you ever came down out of the mountains, and I mean to keep it a good deal longer. This is my home. And it could be a good home for both of us, if the people here ever get the chance to see what I see when I look at you, not a beast, not a threat, but the finest, bravest, most honest person I've ever known. I'd rather stay and make them see it than run somewhere easier and let Ashgrave's kind win the only battle that actually matters. Dura's expression softened into something he had rarely seen on her, a vulnerability she guarded even more fiercely than her physical strength. You would fight that battle for me, even though it would be so much simpler to leave. I'd fight 100 battles harder than that for you, Amos said. You put yourself between me and a mercenary's blade without a second thought. Least I can do is stand my ground here and make sure the people I've spent 6 years serving learn to see you the way I do. She kissed him then, slow and grateful, and something in the set of her shoulders eased, as though she had needed, more than she'd wanted to admit, to hear that he would not simply retreat from the difficulty of loving her openly. The chance to prove it came sooner than either of them expected, and in a form neither could have predicted. Word came upriver in early autumn that Lord Ashgrave, humiliated by the failure of his ambush and facing formal charges from the crown for treason, had fled his keep with a remnant of loyal men-at-arms rather than face judgment, and that his flight had carried him north, along the very trade road that ran through Stonewade, in a desperate bid to cross into the Ironback foothills where he hoped, absurdly, to buy sanctuary from some renegade orc clan willing to shelter a fugitive lord in exchange for stolen crown gold. The pursuit that followed turned the long chase of the past months entirely on its head. Where once Dura had hunted saboteurs and Amos had run to warn her of ambush in the dark, now it was Ashgrave's own desperate flight that made hunter and hunted trade places again and again along the road. A Veldrick cavalry patrol nearly caught him at a river ford 2 days south, only for his remaining guards to ambush and scatter the patrol in turn. A company of Ironback scouts nearly cornered him in a mountain pass, only to be driven back when Ashgrave's men set the dry autumn grass alight behind them to cover their retreat. By the time word reached Stonewade that the fugitive lord and his dwindling band were making straight for the crossing itself, intending to force their way over the very bridge Amos had rebuilt, both the crown's soldiers and the Ironback war parties converging on the chase had been left days behind, outmaneuvered by a desperate man with nothing left to lose. It fell in the end to Stonewade itself, to the ordinary people of the crossroads, human and orc together, to stand between Ashgrave and the crossing that meant his escape. Amos was at the toll house when the warning came, a breathless rider from the south shouting that Ashgrave's men were less than an hour behind him and riding hard. He did not hesitate. He rang the alarm bell for the second time in his life, and this time, when the people of Stonewade came running from their homes and stalls and forges, they found not chaos but purpose, for the town had spent a season now learning, however grudgingly, to trust the crossing that Amos and Dura had bled to protect, and they were not about to let one desperate lord tear it down on his way to buying his freedom. Dura arrived at the head of a dozen of her warriors within minutes, having ridden the moment the bell rang, and together she and Amos organized what defense they could with the time they had wagons overturned to block the road approach, Cobb and the smith handing out whatever spears and hunting bows the town possessed. The townsfolk who had spat at Amos's feet only weeks before now standing shoulder to shoulder with orc warriors they had feared their whole lives, because the alternative was watching their crossing, their treaty, their fragile new peace burn in one desperate man's last act of spite. Ashgrave's charge broke against Stonewade like a wave against rock. He had perhaps 30 men left, exhausted and half-mad with the desperation of the hunted, and they found not an empty crossing but a town rallied, human archers on the rooftops and orc spears in the road, and at the center of it all, standing together at the foot of the bridge, Amos Fletcher and Dura Doomhammer, side by side, refusing to yield an inch of the ground they had bled to build. It was Dura's spear that finally struck Ashgrave from his horse as he tried to force his way through the barricade, and it was Amos, unarmed still by inclination if not by circumstance, who wrestled the Lord's dagger from his hand as he fell and held it to his throat with hands that did not shake nearly as much as he expected, until the Crown's own cavalry, finally catching up to the chase they had been losing for days, arrived to take the traitor lord into custody at last. It was over in minutes. In the end, a chase spanning weeks resolved in one furious quarter hour at the foot of a bridge, and when the dust settled and Ashgrave was dragged away in chains, cursing everyone and everything, Stonewade stood not just intact but changed. Amos looked around at the townsfolk lowering their borrowed weapons, at farmers and orc warriors alike breathing hard with the same shared relief, at Mother Pricewell herself, of all people, helping bind up a wounded ironback scout's arm with strips torn from her own shawl, and understood that something had shifted here that no treaty document, however carefully worded, could ever have accomplished alone. Dura found him amid the settling chaos, blood on her spear but a light in her eyes that had nothing to do with battle. "You held your ground," she said. "We held our ground," Amos corrected. "All of us, together." She looked around at the town, at the mingled crowd of human and orc, exhausted and victorious, and for the first time since Amos had known any of them, entirely unafraid of one another, and something in her fierce features eased into an expression of wondering hope he had never seen there before. "Perhaps," she said softly, "this crossing might yet be a home for us both, Fletcher. A real one." "Told you it would be," Amos said, and kissed her right there in front of the whole gathered town. In the fading light of a battle both of them had somehow survived, and this time no one looked away in disgust, and no one spat, and somewhere in the crowd, unmistakably, someone began to cheer. The weeks that followed passed in a warmth Amos had never dared hope for during his 6 lonely years at the toll house. With Ashgrave's treason exposed and his final desperate act witnessed by half of Stonewade, the last serious threat to the treaty crumbled, and what remained was simply the slow, steady work of two peoples learning to share a crossing, a market, a life. The town held a proper feast that autumn, the kind Stonewade had not seen in living memory. Tables set up along the length of the Mendied Bridge itself, so that human cook fires and orc spit roasts smoked side by side, and children human, and cautiously at first, a handful of young orcs from a nearby clan encampment, chased each other along the riverbank in the last warm light of the season. Lady Marrow herself returned for the occasion, along with old Cregor Ashfang, both of them insisting on raising a cup to the bridge-warden and the war leader whose stubborn, unlikely love had, in the retelling that would follow them for years afterward, become as much a symbol of the new peace as the treaty document itself. It was Cregor who stood on an overturned barrel that evening, silencing the crowd with the sheer gravel weight of his voice, and declared that Dura Doomhammer, having proven her worth not only as a war leader but as a bridge between their two peoples in the truest sense, would be granted leave by the Ironback clans to make her home wherever she chose, including, should she wish it, within the walls of a human crossroads town, without any clan obligation calling her back to the mountains. Dura had not expected the announcement. Amos could tell by the way her hand found his beneath the table, gripping tight, her composure cracking for just a moment into something raw and disbelieving. "You do not have to decide tonight," Amos murmured to her, low enough for only her to hear. "Whatever you choose, I'll go where you go. I meant that." "I know you would," she said, turning to look at him, firelight dancing warm across her face. "That is precisely why I am not afraid to choose this." She lifted her cup, and her voice, when she spoke again, carried clear across the hushed crowd. "I choose Stonewade. I choose this crossing and this bridge, and the man who rebuilt it with his own hands and refused to run from what loving me would cost him. I have led war bands and won duels and buried more kin to this border than I can count. I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of this." The cheer that went up from the gathered crowd, human and orc voices mingling freely for perhaps the first time in Stonewade's long history, was loud enough to send birds scattering from the tree line. And Amos, pulling Dura into his arms amid the noise and the firelight and the smoke of two people's cook fires mingling into one, thought that he had never in his life felt so entirely, thoroughly, and permanently found. They were married that winter, not by any priest of Mother Pricewell's chapel nor by any ironback shaman, but by a ceremony both peoples helped design together, a joining of hands over running water at the very center of the bridge, human vows spoken in the old tongue of Veldrick answered by orc vows spoken in the guttural, beautiful language of the Ironbacks, witnessed by Lady Marrow and Cregor Ashfang both, and by the whole of Stonewade gathered on the banks in the pale winter sunlight. No longer a crowd divided by suspicion, but a single community come to see their bridge-warden and his fierce, beloved wife bound together for good. Afterward, Amos and Dura made their home in the little stone toll house at the foot of the bridge, expanded now with a second room built by orc and human hands working side by side, its walls hung with both a Veldrick hunting bow and an ironback warspear, a home that belonged fully to neither world and entirely to both. Dura took up a place on the joint patrol the treaty had established, riding the crossing alongside human soldiers who had once feared her and now trusted her with their lives, while Amos continued his toll-keeping, though he was, by unspoken agreement of the whole crossroads, no longer merely a toll-keeper but something closer to Stonewade's own quiet, steady heart, the man who had bled for the bridge, and loved fiercely enough to hold two peoples together on it. On quiet evenings, when the caravans had passed and the lanterns were lit and the ashwater ran dark and peaceful beneath the mended planks, Dura would find him on the toll house step, the same step where she had once sat beside him with a war still smoldering in her chest, and settle against his side, her fingers finding the faded mark at his throat, tracing it the way she always did, as though reassuring herself the claim still held. "Any regrets, bridge-warden?" She asked him one such evening, the question more tender than teasing now, worn smooth by months of asking. "Only one," Amos said, pulling her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That it took a spear at my throat to get you to finally ask my name." Dura laughed, low and warm, the sound he had come to treasure above every other sound in the world. "I have never regretted asking it," she said, "not for one single moment since." And there, on the bridge that had nearly broken them and instead had bound them together forever, with the river running steady beneath their feet and the whole of Stonewade sleeping peacefully on both its banks, Amos Fletcher held the fierce and magnificent woman who had chosen him above all others, and felt, at long last, entirely and unshakably home.